It's 1984 and a new heir has been born within the Windosr family. Say hi to the camera, Harry. Oh, look at him. Oh, and there is his older brother, William. Such a loving family, right? Well, I'm sorry to say that all of this is nothing but a lie, and you're about to find out why. For the British royal family, setting themselves as an example of values and a symbol of unity was, and still is, one of their main goals. But the truth would come out after the arrival of Prince Charles and Diana's second son. The two kids grew as the years passed, and their marriage started falling apart and having many public scandals. The perfect family ended up being just an illusion. Time went by, but the story has not changed. A lot of people who may not be familiarized with the crown may think that after Diana's death, everything became peaceful within the royal family. They may even think that the crown is evil no more. Well, you should know that that's not the case with British nobility, especially with these two brothers. The crown's heirs. In this documentary, we will dive deep into the hallways inside Buckingham Palace and the crown's dark secrets. We will discover their ancestors' past and resentment, which have not been forgotten and certainly not forgiven. We'll see what this bond of monarchic love turned into and what were the reasons that detonated William and Harry's separation. For their past would become their future. We bring you all the secrets behind the Windosr heirs. Welcome to the next chapter. The conflict between brothers is not something unheard of historically. Quarrels like William and Harry's have been seen throughout generations, and there is always a common factor: power corrupts. Let me tell you 3 different stories so that you can understand this better. Story number 1. Let's start with Edward VIII's and George VI's story, where Edward, after completing 300 days of rule after the death of his father, renounced the throne for love, but not any kind of love. It was for his lover, Wallis Simpson, an American who was not even divorced from her second marriage and who showed great interest in being part of nobility. However, royal descendants were not allowed to marry a divorced person during those times. Of course, this scandal made every press headline and was received by the people as treason to the royal institution. Nevertheless, the crown's succession concerning the brothers meant an everlasting rupture between them, since it had always been clear that Edward would be the throne's heir, and so George never received any real preparation to be king. He lacked confidence and grew up admiring his older brother, who always protected him as a child. They were very united as kids, but Edward's abdication of the throne was taken as serious betrayal by George, given the enormous responsibility that was suddenly thrown at him. Edward felt betrayed at the same time by George, who denied Wallis the title of Her Royal Highness. After these events, the encounters between the two brothers were increasingly rare. This went on until King George's death. He lost the battle against lung cancer due to the crown's burdens that led him to smoke uncontrollably. This tragedy takes us to our second story, Elizabeth and Margaret. Story number 2. Born to see their uncle rule, Elizabeth and her sister Margaret never imagined that the crown would end up at their feet. They were 10 and 6 years old respectively when their uncle abdicated the throne, and their father became king. Since then, Elizabeth did everything in her power to rise to the occasion. However, the time came too soon, because at only 25 years old, after her father passed away, she was crowned queen. The bond between Elizabeth and Margaret had always been strong. They dressed identically as kids and played non-stop. They were almost like twins. But when Elizabeth began to be treated as the heir, a different education was given to her as well. This saddened Margaret, who wanted to do the same things as her sister. Even though there was loyalty, there was also competition. There was always jealousy between them, and Margaret adored being under the spotlight, getting all the attention, while on the other hand, Elizabeth was a very formal and introverted girl. Margaret always dreamt of the luxury and fame that came along with being from the royal family, something Elizabeth personally hated, being crowned at just 25 years old. Plenty of times, Margaret suggested Elizabeth abdicate the throne like her uncle Edward did in the past. But this only infuriated Elizabeth. She would not allow her younger sister to become the important one. Their relationship became even more complicated when Margaret, who was barely 17 years old, wanted to marry the Air Force captain and King George's equerry, Peter Towson, who was, as you may have guessed, divorced. But a marriage like this could not be accepted again, and so the Queen, her own sister, denied her permission, forcing Margaret to give up her love life, which led her into a deep depression. This event would set into motion an untamable life. Marrying a commoner, having extramarital romances, and substance abuse. The princess caused many scandals, and even though there was never a real breaking point between the two sisters, there was always a slight resentment from Margaret for being in second place and not having a concise role within the family. Story number 3. Finally, we'll add King Charles and his brother's story to the list. Although they have been very discreet, they have had their differences. This is due to the fact that Charles always demonstrated superiority. He knew he was meant to be number one. That bothered his brothers, especially Prince Andrew, who aspired to the crown, being second in line of succession. But with the arrival of William and Harry, the Duke of York was moved to 7th place, which did not please him. Now, given the 15-year difference between him and Charles, Andrew was always considered the most isolated member of the family, and it was believed he never fully understood his royal position and had no clear understanding of life itself. This historical context shows how complicated relationships are between siblings within the royal family. It will help you understand the complexity of our protagonist's relationship, but it's also important to consider one last aspect that is crucial to understand why they behave like they do. In order to do so, we must travel back in time. We need to talk about Charles and Diana. Diana and Charles met at a hunting party in Althorp in 1977. But their relationship did not start until 1979 after meeting again in Balmoral Castle, the royal summer residence. Their relationship had been going on for a couple months when the engagement was announced. It's said that they only had seen each other a dozen times before the big day. The wedding took place on July 21st, 1981 at St. Paul's Cathedral in London and was viewed by millions of people who saw nothing but a fairy tale love story. Out of all the babies born on June 21st of 1982, only one brought worldwide attention, and that was William, the firstborn prince. William's birth brought joy and was seen as a good omen by the English people, since they were going through a bad time due to the separations that were taking place in the Commonwealth. In general terms, it is an intergovernmental body of economic and cultural cooperation led by the United Kingdom. That is, the peoples and nations invaded by England, whose inhabitants, at the time, were concerned with Australian attempts of separation. Even though Charles and Diana's marriage seemed to be doing just fine, giving the illusion of them building a solid family, there were glimpses of complications which blew up at the arrival of their second son. 2 years later, they welcomed Harry on September 15th of 1984. But instead of it being a joyful event, it sadly announced that this fairy tale was coming to an end. But why? First of all, Diana's second pregnancy was a result of Buckingham's pressure to assure William had a brother. That way, they'd comply with the crown's tradition of having an heir and his replacement. Second, Charles always said he wanted a daughter as a second child. So Diana kept the news hidden, since she knew from a very early stage that she was having a boy. Diana saw the disappointment in Charles' eyes when he found out it was a boy. He even mocked him for being red-headed. The context is that Diana's lineage has a big presence of redheads, and Charles hated that the child resembled Diana, which ended up burying their love for good. These comments hurt Diana deeply, and from this point on, their relationship went into a downward spiral. Since it's tradition in the royal family, Charles and Diana hired sitters to look after their children for them to be able to fulfill their royal duties. Most of their childhood, especially William's, was spent around sitters. Barbara Barnes was one of them, a 42-year-old woman, to whom Princess Margaret and her lady's maid had already given their approval. Barbara became a substitute mother for William, teaching him how to walk, talk, and read. She even consoled him during nights when he woke up crying. The bond between them was so real, so close, that such dedication began to bother Diana, who took on a somewhat possessive attitude. One day, without warning, she asked Barnes to leave. From this point on, Diana dedicated more time to her children. They became her world. And given that the lack of love in the past had brought unpleasant events to several members of the family, such as the ones we previously narrated, Diana's biggest fear was for them to grow up without love. In her own case, for example, Diana always defined her childhood as traumatic after her parents' divorce, and she'd stated that the absence of her mother changed her life forever. And what can be said about Prince Charles? He lived in a palace surrounded by sitters where his parents were absent most of the time. When they dedicated time to him, they were always cold and distant. Also, because of how introverted and sensitive he was, and because of how strict the crown is, he was never allowed to mature at his own pace. Diana, being conscious of this, made a huge effort to give them a childhood as normal as possible, with equal treatment for both brothers, leaving hierarchies aside. She wanted to avoid, at any cost, for them to become like their ancestors, or worse, like their father. She was very close to them, kind, and committed to their happiness. She wanted them to always have their feet on the ground. And who could have known this better than her? For even if the Spencers were a wealthy family, they never showed off their luxurious lifestyle. On the other hand, they were known for their modesty. That's how she started to make a difference. While the previous generations had their children receive their education inside the palace, Diana registered them into a local school and encouraged them to always share and play with their classmates. They were always having fun during their free time. They watched TV, played video games, and even went to amusement parks. They also spent weeks in their summer house in Highgrove, away from the public eye, and made trips with the Spencers to the Caribbean, and even skiing trips to Austria. All of this was good for Diana to get away from the royal family and her husband, who had no interest in being a present father. He spent his days traveling or at parties with his lover Camilla. But something Diana could not escape from was the paparazzis, who were there at all times. And even though Diana knew she had a specific role to play for the press, she did not accept posing for them, and alongside her security team, she always protected her children and demanded that their privacy be respected. When William began studying at Eton, the difference from his previous school became very clear. It wasn't a small institution anymore, nor intimate. It was filled with students who were not amazed by William's presence. The school was filled with people who came from extremely wealthy families. In other words, England's finest. Even though he eventually made some friends, William became slightly introverted towards the cameras. At this time, Diana wasn't much present in his life anymore. She couldn't keep guiding him as she wanted, not because she didn't wish to do so, but the crown did not want her close to the successor of the throne. Diana became an uncomfortable member for the family, and they already had plans for her. Little Harry was the most affected when Charles and Diana decided to get a divorce. He didn't understand why his parents could not be together. Nonetheless, in spite of all the pain and suffering it caused him, he understood that he had to accept the divorce if it made his mother happy. William, on the other hand, didn't care much, for he had the clear purpose of becoming the king one day. He preferred spending time with the royals, especially with his grandmother. She molded him to her taste. She saw in William what she never saw in her own son, a born-to-rule leader. So yes, the differences started to arise every now and then amongst the two brothers. While the first would be the man looking after the legacy and later become king, the other one would simply have a title. He would be just another fancy jar on the shelf. As soon as the divorce was confirmed, Diana was not allowed to spend that much time with her children, for the crown argued that they had to stay in Buckingham since they were the second line of succession. Diana was no longer welcome there. By 1995, amidst all the scandal and chaos that the divorce caused, Princess Diana decided to grant an interview to the BBC journalist Martin Bashir from the Panorama program. In this interview, she revealed details about her marriage, like her husband's relationship with Camilla Parker, and some other personal problems as well, like her bulimia and how the crown handled everything from the shadows, how the Queen became the shadow of their lives. This interview was viewed by over 20 million British citizens, and it was considered the century's premise. And for the first time, all the rumors were confirmed. The crown was evil. Diana knew what this interview would cause, so she managed to see William the night before. The world and even the crown thought it would be an insignificant visit, so they gave her permission to see the prince. But in reality, Diana explained to William she would have an interview and that it was for her own good, for his and his little brother's future. But after seeing how the story ended and how she misspoke of his blood, of his father, and seeing how these declarations had a negative impact in his entire world, William got very upset with his mother. This was the breaking point in their relationship, and since then, his father's family became everything. He began avoiding his mother, and he slowly distanced himself from his once greatest love. It was different for Harry. Diana did not wish to explain to him she would take that interview. He was not ready to understand that truth. The newspapers and radio would not speak of anything else after the interview was aired. Therefore, the crown totally forbid Harry to be aware of the situation. This scandal was a perfect excuse to manipulate the heirs, and the time Diana had invested in them had now been in vain. They were separated from her after the divorce, and with Diana's interview, William had been left with a bitter taste in his mouth. Now, the crown would finally handle the future heir to its will, and even though Diana was not close, she was still a threat. She could still get in the way, and that would not be allowed. Scotland. Loch Muick, vacations with the royal family. When summer came, the kids decided they wanted to spend the holidays with their father and the royal family fishing in South Scotland. Meanwhile, Diana was in France avoiding the press. At this time, William and Harry got along just fine. Harry felt protected by his brother and followed him everywhere. The plan for those vacations was for the kids to travel from Balmoral Castle to London, where they would meet their mother and they'd spend the last 3 days together before being sent back to school. The night before the reunion, Diana called them on the phone, as she did almost every day. But this time, Harry was quick to end the call so that he could go back and play with his cousins. William did not feel like talking to his mother either. He still had not forgiven her for that interview, and Harry just wanted to go back and play. They hung up without telling her how much they loved her. They did not know that would be the last time they would hear her voice. France. The Ritz, 12:25 a.m. A few minutes after midnight, Diana and Dodi Al-Fayed, who was her partner at the time, left their suite at the Ritz Hotel in Paris and headed to Dodi's apartment near the Champs-Élysées. The vehicle drove inside the Seoul Bridge at a high speed. The driver was flashed by the paparazzis, lost control of the vehicle, and crashed into one of the tunnel's columns. Both Dodi and the driver died in the crash. But Diana was taken to the hospital where the medics tried to stabilize her for over an hour without success. Diana had died. That morning, before William and Harry woke up, Queen Elizabeth ordered all televisions, radios, and newspapers inside the summer house to be hidden so that their father would be the one to give them the bad news. They were not ready to know the truth. Diana's death had not been an accident. Once it had been decided that the crown would be in charge of the funeral, they decided to prolong it as much as possible so they could manipulate the kids' perspective at Balmoral. They wanted to soften the blow. The brothers said they felt guilty. That day, they only wanted to go back and play with their cousins, and just because they were mad, they didn't say something they used to say to her every single time. "We love you, Mommy." During her funeral, it could be seen they were severely affected. but they had to hide their emotions. They had been told to do so while at Balmoral. They were told it was their responsibility to show strength in front of the people, the Crown and the Windsors, and that they should never express their emotions in front of the world. It was part of the rules of being royalty. Even after such a tragic event, the brothers became even closer, at least for a while. They kept protecting each other. Even if they had different personalities, they complemented each other, for only they could share what they had experienced on that August 31st of 1997. The loss of the only person who had truly loved them for who they really were, and not for their nobility, but for being her beloved children. Even though Diana always made a huge effort to educate her kids as equally as possible, they ended up building their own personalities after they grew up. If we take a look at William, he physically resembles his mother, but his personality is completely like his father's. As I told you, he was a family's spoiled child. On the other hand, Harry was totally like his mother. He always tried to follow in her footsteps, and when she was no longer there to guide him, Harry found a new refuge with the Spencers, Diana's family. This was found convenient for the Crown since they wished to separate him further. The bond that once existed between the two brothers began to fade during Harry's teenage years and William's early adulthood. William turned his back on Harry when he started addressing his responsibilities as future king, and by spending time with his grandmother and going to college. Harry did not only feel his brother's rejection, but also his father's. Growing up, knowing that his father only cared about Camilla and himself was a disappointment for Harry. Besides, the only person left for him was his brother, who now had also rejected him. All of this hurt Harry very badly. And so, Harry got into substance abuse, girls, parties, and he had bad grades in school, for which at 17, his father sent him to spend one day at the Phoenix House Rehab Center. Harry was deeply hurt knowing that his father felt ashamed of him, and when he tried to reach out to his brother for help, William told him he had no time to deal with his substance abuse, and he flew to Chile instead, since it was more important for William to disconnect from the tough world of nepotism than helping his little brother. The problems did not end there, and they kept giving us memorable scandals. In October of 2004, Harry had an altercation with a photographer outside of a club. It was said that Harry was only trying to push the camera off his face, but the photographer claimed Harry attacked him intentionally. One of the biggest scandals would come a year later. The Sun newspaper published on their front page a picture of Harry wearing a costume with a swastika armband. Meanwhile, William behaved himself and was seen as a focused one, down to earth and away from all the scandals. He was becoming closer to his father. He followed him and protected him at all costs. William kept setting an image for himself as the heir committed to the monarchy's cause and left his younger brother to his fate, disoriented and lost. As we have said, just another fancy jar on the shelf. There is a reason for us telling you the memorable stories of the past Windsor brothers. As you can tell by now, all generations have had a triumphant sibling and one that falls into substance abuse and scandals. As you can see, Harry was heading towards that same pattern, but something changed. After Harry finished his studies at Eton in 2003, he decided to take a sabbatical. He wanted to run away from all the scandals. He worked at a sheep farm in Australia and worked with HIV orphans in Lesotho. He started doing what his mother once did, to make something good out of being famous, and for all of that money to serve a righteous cause. By 2005, as part of the monarchical tradition, Harry began his training at the Royal Military Academy in Sandhurst. The war in Iraq had recently started, and Harry wanted to be in the front lines, but he was not allowed to do so. He was sent to Afghanistan instead, being there until 2013. He returned to England as captain and helicopter pilot. The tough military education changed Harry. His rebel and misunderstood childish phases were long gone. He had matured. His mother would have been proud. But also, he began to realize how dark his family really was. He realized what they had done to his mother, but most importantly, he knew who his brother really was. While all of this happened, our other protagonist graduated with honors within the Windosr family. He was one of them now. He had married Kate Middelton, whom he met in 2001 at St. Andrew's College. Kate had all the lineage sought by the crown in order to approve a marriage. She was pretty, classy, and came from a good family. But most importantly, her skin color. You'll see why this is important in a minute. On April 29th of 2011, Prince William married Kate Middelton at the Westminster Abbey. He took his brother Harry as his knight of honor, who was doubtful about his sister-in-law. He saw her in the same interest his whole family had: privilege. At the beginning, William and Kate stole all the headlines from the press. They were the future heirs to the throne. They obviously had to be in the spotlight. But it all ended when Harry returned to the public eye after his military career. Harry was, and still is, the reincarnation of his mother to the world's eyes. He carried with him her way of being, as well as her social message, always looking after the less fortunate. William did not have that natural charisma about him, and when he realized his brother was becoming more important, William could not stand him. The relationship between brothers became more and more distant with time. They got together by protocol, but William always talked to his family about how he could not stand Harry taking all the headlines. Both his father and grandmother understood this feeling. They had been through the same with their own siblings, and Charles also experienced this with Diana. And it was here that the last nail in the family coffin would come. The person who would end up separating the Windosr family, and most importantly the two brothers, was Meghan Markle. Meghan was an American actress, divorced, anti-monarchy, and even worse to the crown's eye, she was biracial. Harry soon fell in love with the young actress, and they announced their engagement only after a few dates. The entire Windosr family was infuriated after hearing this. The relationship with that girl was wrong according to all the family laws. Both the Queen and William could not stand her, so William went and talked to his brother. He explained that this new relationship of his with that little actress was poorly seen and that she was a woman that would try to control him. Harry did not take this well and ended up in a fist fight with his brother. From this point on, the love between these two brothers was completely lost. Harry talked to the crown's press and communication teams to set things right. He would be with his brother during protocol events, and he would always give his best face, but he did not consider him his brother anymore. Second, he wanted his grandmother to stay away from his fiancé, since he found out about the racist comments against Meghan. Oh yes, in case you didn't know, Queen Elizabeth was one of those. And third, he did not wish to see his father unless it was absolutely necessary. He knew about all the money laundering deals as well as the obvious situation with his mother, so he did not want to know anything about him. These rules were not very well received by the royal family, but they thought that perhaps this way, Harry would be kept safely away and they could do what they wanted without being overshadowed. But they were not counting on something, and that was Meghan. Meghan talked to Harry and told him they did not need those parasites by their side. They were a toxic family and they had attacked his mother. His grandmother hated them, and his father had no interest in them either, and his brother was just one more douchebag. Harry understood this and finally put an end to it.
Breaking news in video published to his Sussex Royal Instagram page.
To step
Prince Harry
back as
has just
senior
publicly
royal.
addressed the decision by him and his wife
Buckingham
Meghan
has confirmed that the Duke and Duchess of Sussex will not be returning as working members of the royal family.
After their wedding and the birth of their first son, they took the most controversial decision in decades regarding the crown. They renounced the royal family. They no longer wished to be related to the Windsor lineage since they were all rotten and out of touch from reality. Meghan and Harry wished for something better for their lives, and Harry no longer wanted William, who was once his hero, in his life. By renouncing their nobility, they also gave up the millions of pounds that are given to them just for being part of the royal family. They wanted to make their own money, but Harry knew that he had to speak the truth about his family, just like his mother once did. So, they granted Oprah an interview in which they disclosed how the crown had treated them as a couple, how Meghan was discriminated against, and how Harry was even assaulted by his own brother. William was furious after this happened. His own blood speaking badly of their family was what he hated the most. So just like William did with his mother, Harry would no longer be his brother. It's hard to imagine how a simple throne, a simple title, could destroy such pure love. How it can separate two brothers that loved and looked after each other. How greed is the poison of the Windsors. How they are destined to destroy each other. In case you were wondering, no, this story does not have a happy ending. That bitter taste in your mouth is what the crown has left in the world. I'm sure that Diana, wherever she may be, is currently heartbroken seeing how all her effort to make her sons better than their ancestors was not enough. She needed more time. Even though she fought to break that canon, history simply repeated itself. Maybe in another life, or in another reality, these two little brothers did have a happy ending. Thank you for watching this video. Remember, we love reading your guys' comments. Don't forget to subscribe if you enjoy our documentaries and share this with friends who love crown-related topics. Don't forget to like this video, and I will see you in the next chapter.